I never expected that a mountain trail I had walked 100 times would be the place I got completely lost. For years, my life had been a map of my own making, each street and landmark meticulously labeled. My apartment was a grid of clean lines and monochrome palettes. My work as a graphic designer was about imposing order on chaos, creating balance from a jumble of client demands. And my weekends were a single, repeating path, a 7-mile loop through the Greenwater Preserve, a slice of tamed wilderness just outside the city. It was my pressure release valve, a routine so ingrained it had become a form of meditation. It was also where I saw him. He was a fixed point in my weekend orbit, as reliable as the ancient oak that marked the second mile. I didn't know his name, of course. To me, he was simply the man from the trail. He was tall, with shoulders that seemed built to carry more than the simple day pack he always wore. His hair was dark and thick, often messy from the wind. He moved with a quiet economy, a steadiness that felt geological, as if he were part of the landscape itself. He had a golden retriever who was always with him, a happy, panting shadow that trotted at his heels. I kept him at a distance, the way one appreciates a piece of art in a museum. You can look, you can admire the form and the skill, but you cannot touch. You understand the velvet rope is there for a reason. My reason was the simple, unforgiving glint of gold on his left ring finger. It was a barrier more definitive than any velvet rope, a small, circular declaration that he belonged to another world, one I had no right to enter. He was a completed painting, and I was just a visitor in the gallery of his life, passing through. So I collected details about him like a secret, hoarded treasure. The low, rumbling timbre of his voice when he would say, "Easy, Gus," to his dog. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled at something the dog did. The scent that sometimes drifted on the breeze as we passed, a clean, sharp mix of sawdust, earth, and something like cedar. He was an architect, I decided, or a carpenter. Someone who built things with his hands, solid things that were meant to last. It suited his presence, that sense of grounded capability. He existed in a separate reality, a brief, idyllic scene I was allowed to witness twice a week. Our interactions were minimal, a quiet nod of acknowledgement, a slight, polite smile as we passed each other going in opposite directions on the loop. For me, these moments were charged with a silent, aching reverence. For him, I was likely just another face, another pair of hiking boots on the trail. I told myself this was enough. Observing was safer than participating. My ordered world had no room for the kind of chaos a man like that could introduce, especially a man who was already spoken for. The walls I had built around my life were high and sturdy for a reason. They kept me safe. They kept me lonely. But it was a loneliness I understood, a loneliness I could control. It was a quiet ache, familiar and predictable, unlike the sharp, unpredictable pain of rejection. The day it all changed began like any other Saturday. The sky was overcast, a flat, pewter gray that threatened rain but held back. The forecast had promised nothing more than a passing shower, and I was not one to be deterred by a little water. The trail was my sanctuary, and I needed it. A project at work had been particularly draining, a chaotic mess of conflicting feedback and impossible deadlines. My internal grid was misaligned, and only the familiar rhythm of my feet on the dirt path could set it right again. I saw him at the trailhead, unloading his retriever, Gus, from the back of a slightly dusty, dark green truck. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing strong, capable-looking hands. He gave me that same brief, polite nod as I pulled into the adjacent parking spot. My heart did its usual, stupid little flutter, a traitorous bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I busied myself with my own pack, checking the straps, making sure my water bottle was secure, all the little rituals I used to feign composure. By the time I was ready, he and Gus were already disappearing into the trees, a splash of worn red flannel against the deep green and brown of the forest. I started my hike in the opposite direction, as I always did. It was part of the routine. This way, we would cross paths at the halfway point, near the scenic overlook. I could anticipate the moment, prepare for it, and then spend the second half of my hike replaying the fleeting, 2-second interaction in my head. It was a pathetic little system, but it was mine. The first few miles were quiet. The air was heavy and damp, thick with the smell of pine needles and rich, dark earth. The threatened shower began as a fine mist, clinging to my eyelashes and dampening my hair. It was pleasant, cooling. But then the sky, which had been a uniform gray, began to curdle into something darker, more bruised. The mist thickened into a steady drizzle, then a proper rain. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the distant hills, a sound that felt more like a vibration in my chest than something I heard with my ears. I should have turned back. The logical, orderly part of my brain knew this. But I was stubborn. I was only a mile from the overlook, the halfway point. Turning back felt like giving in, like letting the chaos win. So I pulled up my hood and pressed on, my boots making sucking sounds in the increasingly muddy trail. The storm broke with a sudden, violent ferocity. It was as if the sky had simply split open. The rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets, blurring the world into a wash of green and gray. The thunder was no longer distant. It was a deafening crack that seemed to happen directly overhead, followed by an immediate, brilliant flash of lightning that bleached the forest white for a split second. The path dissolved into a slick, treacherous stream of mud and runoff. And that's when I fell. My right foot slipped on a wet root, and my ankle twisted with a sickening, fiery snap of pain. I went down hard, my hip and shoulder slamming into the muddy ground. For a moment, I just lay there, stunned, with the cold rain plastering my hair to my face and the sharp, throbbing agony in my ankle screaming for attention. I tried to push myself up, but putting any weight on my right foot sent a fresh, blinding wave of pain through my leg. Panic, cold and sharp, began to cut through the shock. I was alone, injured, and a good 3 miles from the parking lot. The trail was barely visible. My carefully ordered world had not just been disrupted, it had been washed away in a torrent of rain and mud. I was trying to drag myself to the relative shelter of a large pine tree when I heard it. A bark. It was sharp and clear, cutting through the roar of the rain. I looked up, squinting through the deluge, and saw a familiar golden shape bounding through the trees. Gus. And a few moments later, his owner emerged from the gray curtain of the storm, his red flannel shirt now a dark, sodden maroon. He saw me immediately. His expression, which had been one of concern as he scanned the woods for his dog, sharpened into focused alarm. In a few long strides, he was kneeling beside me in the mud, his presence a sudden, solid shield against the storm's fury. "Are you all right?" His voice was that same low rumble I had memorized, but now it was laced with an urgency that made my heart pound for an entirely new reason. "My ankle," I managed to say, my own voice sounding thin and weak. "I think I twisted it. Badly." He didn't waste time with more questions. His hands, large and surprisingly gentle, moved to my leg. "Let me see." He carefully probed the area around my ankle bone, his touch sending a strange, electric warmth through the cold, wet fabric of my pants. It was an impersonal, clinical touch, but it felt intensely intimate. I flinched as his fingers found the exact point of the injury. "Sorry," he murmured. "Yeah, that's swelling up fast. We need to get you out of this rain." He looked around, his gaze sweeping the dense, rain-lashed woods. The easy confidence I had always admired from afar was still there, but now it was directed at me, at my problem. It was a strange and overwhelming feeling, to be the focus of that steady calm. "My phone has no signal," I said, the panic starting to bubble up again. "And the map in my pack is probably just pulp by now." He nodded, unfazed. "Mine too. Don't worry. There's an old ranger cabin about a quarter-mile from here. It's not on the main trail, but I know the way. It's not much, but it's dry." He looked at me, his eyes a clear, serious hazel. "Can you stand if I help you?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure. He positioned himself, hooking a strong arm under my shoulders and around my back. "Okay, on 3. 1, 2, 3 inch." He lifted, and I leaned heavily on him, my arm draped over his broad shoulders. The pain in my ankle was excruciating, but it was strangely distant, overshadowed by the shocking reality of his body pressed against mine. I could feel the solid wall of his chest, the heat of him even through our soaked clothes. The scent I had only ever caught in passing, sawdust, cedar, rain, was now all around me, an intoxicating, overwhelming cloud. My carefully maintained museum distance had been obliterated. The art had stepped off the pedestal and was now holding me up in the middle of a storm. My ordered world was in ruins, and I found myself clinging to the very center of its chaos. The trek to the cabin was a blur of pain and proximity. Every step was a fresh agony in my ankle, a jolt that made me gasp. But each gasp was muffled against his flannel-clad shoulder, and each stumble was met with a steadying grip from the arm wrapped firmly around my waist. He took most of my weight without a word of complaint, moving with that same unhurried, powerful grace I had watched from afar, even on the treacherous, muddy ground. I was completely dependent on him, a feeling so foreign and terrifying it left me speechless. My world had shrunk to the space we occupied. The roar of the rain, the solidness of his body, the scent of wet earth in him, the burning fire in my ankle. He was a constant, warm presence in the cold, chaotic storm. I focused on the rhythm of his breathing, the steady beat of his heart that I could feel through his chest. It was an anchor in the swirling vortex of my panic and pain. Finally, through the sheets of rain, I saw it, a small, dark shape huddled amongst the trees. It was a simple, one-room structure of dark, weathered wood, with a small, covered porch and a single grimy window. It looked ancient and forgotten, but to me, it was a palace. He helped me up the 2 rickety steps and onto the porch, easing me down to sit on the dry, dusty planks. Gus, who had been circling us anxiously the whole way, came and nudged my hand with his wet nose, whining softly. "Stay here," he said, his voice a little breathless from the effort. He pushed open the cabin door, which groaned in protest, and disappeared inside. A moment later, he was back. "It's dry. Smells like mice and old wood, but it's dry." He helped me inside, half carrying me to a dusty cot that was pushed against one wall. The cabin was Spartan. Besides the cot, there was a small wood-burning stove in the corner, a crude table, and 2 chairs. A film of dust covered everything, and cobwebs hung from the rafters like ghostly decorations. But the sound of the rain was instantly muffled, reduced to a drumming on the tin roof. The air was still and cool and smelled of neglect, but it was a profound relief. He took off his dripping pack and set it on the floor. "Let's get that boot off and take a proper look at your ankle." I nodded, my teeth starting to chatter from the cold. He knelt in front of me, his focus entirely on my injured foot. His fingers worked at the wet laces of my hiking boot, his movements deft and sure. The casual intimacy of the act, this man, this stranger from my fantasies, untying my boot, was dizzying. When the boot was finally off, he carefully peeled away my soaked sock. My ankle was already swollen and turning a bruised, ugly purple. He let out a low whistle. "That's a bad one. We need to elevate it and get some ice on it. But I don't think we're going to find an ice machine out here." He offered a small, wry smile. It was the first time I had seen it up close. It transformed his serious face, making him look younger, more approachable. My stomach did a complicated little flip. "I have a first aid kit in my pack," he said, turning to rummage through it. He pulled out an elastic bandage. "This will have to do for now. We'll wrap it for compression." As he worked, wrapping my ankle with a practiced efficiency, our silence was filled by the sound of the rain on the roof. It was a cozy, isolating sound, sealing us off from the rest of the world. The space was small, and he was close, so close I could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes, the faint lines of exhaustion around them. I watched his hands, strong and calloused, but incredibly gentle as they tended to my injury. I saw the gold band on his finger, a constant, dull gleam in the dim light of the cabin. A painful reminder of the reality I had momentarily forgotten in the chaos of the storm. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done." He finished securing the bandage and looked up, meeting my eyes. "Anyone would have done the same. I'm Julian, by the way." "Leo," I replied. "Julian." His name was Julian. It felt solid, like him. It suited him. Saying my own name felt like a confession, like I was finally admitting my existence to him after months of anonymous observation. He stood and went to the grimy window, peering out at the relentless downpour. "Looks like we're here for a while. The storm's not letting up, and I don't want you trying to walk on that ankle until it's had some rest. It'll be dark soon anyway." The reality of the situation settled over me. I was stranded, in a tiny, abandoned cabin. With him. With Julian. The panic I had felt on the trail was replaced by a different kind of anxiety, a nervous, humming energy that had nothing to do with my injury and everything to do with the man standing a few feet away from me. The walls of the cabin felt like they were closing in, the air growing thick with a tension that was entirely of my own making. My carefully ordered world was a distant memory. I was in uncharted territory now, and I had lost the map. The hours in the cabin unfolded in a strange, suspended reality. Time seemed to stretch and compress, marked only by the shifting light outside the single window and the unrelenting rhythm of the rain on the tin roof. Julian proved to be as capable as I had imagined. He found a small stack of dry firewood left behind by a previous occupant and, with a surprising amount of patience, managed to coax a small, sputtering fire to life in the rusty wood stove. The fire changed everything. It pushed back the damp chill in the air and filled the small room with a flickering, golden light that made the shadows dance. It cast a warm glow on Julian's face as he sat on one of the dusty chairs, methodically stripping off his soaked flannel shirt to reveal a simple gray t-shirt underneath. The damp wool of his shirt smelled of rain and wood smoke. He hung it near the stove to dry, and I tried very hard not to stare at the way the firelight highlighted the strong lines of his shoulders and back. He unpacked his bag, revealing a surprising bounty. A large metal thermos, 2 protein bars, a bag of almonds, and an apple. He laid them out on the small table between us like a feast. "Not much, but it's better than nothing," he said, his voice low and calm. He poured steaming liquid from the thermos into its cap and handed it to me. It was coffee, strong and slightly sweet. The warmth of the plastic cup seeped into my cold hands, a small, grounding comfort. "Thank you," I said again, feeling hopelessly inadequate. I had a half-eaten granola bar and a water bottle in my own pack. I was the picture of unpreparedness. "Don't mention it." He took a sip from his own cup, his eyes on the fire. We sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the logs and the drumming of the rain. The space between us was filled with a quiet, charged awareness. I was hyper-focused on every small detail. The way he held his cup, his long fingers wrapped around it. The quiet, even sound of his breathing. The way Gus had settled on the floor at his feet, chin on his paws, letting out a soft, contented sigh. This was the closest I had ever been to him, and the proximity was both a thrill and a torment. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to remember the ring, to maintain my distance, to rebuild the walls the storm had washed away. But my heart, that stupid, traitorous bird, was fluttering wildly, captivated by the impossible reality of the situation. I was sharing a private, sheltered space with the man from my daydreams. It felt like a scene from a book I was not supposed to be reading. "You walk this trail a lot," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was casual, but the statement sent a jolt through me. He had noticed me. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, most weekends. It helps me think." He nodded, a small, understanding smile touching his lips. "I know what you mean. It's quiet. A good place to untangle things." He looked from the fire to me, his gaze direct and unervingly perceptive. "You always seem very focused, like you're working something out." I felt a flush of heat rise in my cheeks. Had I been that transparent? Had my loneliness and yearning been written all over my face every time I passed him on the trail? "I'm a graphic designer," I offered, as if that explained everything. "My job is all about lines and grids. I guess I try to apply that to my life, too." "Lines and grids," he repeated softly, as if tasting the words. "I get that. I'm an architect. It's all about structure. But sometimes the most interesting things happen when the structure fails." He glanced meaningfully at my bandaged ankle, then back at the storm raging outside the window. His words hung in the air between us. It felt like he was talking about more than just buildings and storms. I held my breath, waiting for him to say more, to give me another piece of the puzzle that was him. I wanted to ask about his work, about his life, about the woman who had placed that gold band on his finger. But the questions felt like an intrusion, a violation of the fragile truce we had formed in this strange, liminal space. Instead, he revealed a crack in his own steady facade. He stared into the fire, his expression turning wistful. "I've been stuck on a design for a new community library for weeks. The clients want something modern, but the neighborhood wants something that feels like it's always been there. Trying to marry the two is difficult." He ran a hand through his damp hair, a gesture of frustration that seemed so uncharacteristically vulnerable it made my chest ache. Sometimes you just want to build something simple, something honest, for walls and a solid roof that keeps the rain out. He looked around our dusty, forgotten shelter and gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. I guess this qualifies. That moment shifted something profound within me. He wasn't just a piece of art anymore, a static image of masculine perfection I admired from a distance. He was a person, with frustrations and creative struggles. He was Julian, an architect who got stuck on designs and found solace on the same trail I did. My feelings for him, which had been a kind of abstract, distant adoration, began to solidify into something deeper, something more real and infinitely more dangerous. As dusk bled into a deep, starless night, the temperature in the cabin dropped. The small fire in the stove provided a welcome circle of warmth, but the corners of the room remained cold. We ate the protein bars and almonds in near silence, the intimacy of the shared, meager meal feeling more profound than any fancy dinner. The exhaustion of the day began to settle deep into my bones. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache in my ankle and a profound weariness. I leaned my head back against the rough wooden wall behind the cot, my eyelids feeling impossibly heavy. Julian noticed. "You should try to get some sleep," he said, his voice gentle. "You've had a rough day." "There's only one cot," I pointed out, my voice thick with fatigue. "It's fine. I'll take the floor." "You need to keep that foot elevated anyway." He was already moving, taking his damp flannel shirt, now mostly dry, and folding it into a makeshift pillow. The thought of him sleeping on the cold, dusty floor while I took the cot felt fundamentally wrong. "No," I said, sitting up straighter. "That's not fair. We can share it. It's big enough. If you don't mind." The words came out in a rush, clumsy and bold. The moment I said them, I wanted to snatch them back. The suggestion was too intimate, too presumptuous. Julian paused, looking from the narrow cot to me. I couldn't read his expression in the flickering firelight. I braced myself for a polite refusal, a gentle reinforcement of the boundaries I had just tried to cross. But he just nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet. "If you're sure." My heart hammered against my ribs. He moved to the cot, and the small space was suddenly dominated by his presence. He laid down on the outer edge, keeping a careful, respectful distance between us, his back mostly to me. The cot was old, and it sagged in the middle, creating a gentle slope that made the distance between us feel precarious. I laid down, my body rigid with tension. My injured ankle was propped up on my wadded-up jacket at the foot of the bed. I was acutely aware of every single thing. The whisper of his clothes as he shifted his weight. The warmth radiating from his back, a line of heat just inches from my own. The subtle scent of him, wood smoke, coffee, and that clean, cedar-like smell that was uniquely his. The cabin was dark now, save for the dying, red-orange glow from the stove's grate. The rain had softened to a gentle, steady patter on the roof. Sleep felt impossible. My mind was a chaotic whirlwind of fear and desire, disbelief and a deep, resonant yearning. I was lying next to Julian. The thought repeated itself over and over, a mantra of pure astonishment. I tried to regulate my breathing, to lie perfectly still, terrified of accidentally brushing against him, of breaking the fragile, unspoken rules of our situation. But the cold had a way of ignoring such rules. Despite the fire, a draft snaked its way through the chinks in the cabin walls. A shiver ran through me, an involuntary tremor I couldn't suppress. He must have felt the mattress move. He shifted, turning slightly toward me. "You cold?" he murmured, his voice a low, sleepy rumble in the darkness. "A little," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. There was a pause, a moment of stillness that felt charged with a million unspoken possibilities. Then, I felt him move again, a deliberate, slow shifting of weight. An arm, solid and warm, came around my shoulders, pulling me gently against him. He drew me in until my back was flush against his chest, until I was enveloped in his heat. My entire body went rigid with shock. This was not happening. It couldn't be. This was a line we were not supposed to cross. This was a gesture of simple, practical warmth. It had to be, but it felt like so much more. It felt like an answer to a question I had never dared to ask. He tucked me in closer, his arm a secure, heavy weight around me. I could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against my shoulder blades. My own heart was a frantic, panicked drum, a wild counter-rhythm to his calm. I should have pulled away. I should have made an excuse, maintained the distance, remembered the ring. But I couldn't. I was too cold, too tired, and too desperate for this impossible warmth. Slowly, tentatively, I let myself relax into his hold. I let my head rest back against his shoulder, let the rigid lines of my body soften. It felt like coming home to a place I had never been. The scent of him was all around me, a comforting, grounding presence. The steady rise and fall of his chest was a lullaby. I thought he had fallen asleep. His breathing was deep and even. In the safety of that assumption, in the deep, quiet darkness of the cabin, I allowed myself a moment of pure, unadulterated weakness. I let the years of carefully constructed walls crumble to dust. The loneliness I had carried for so long felt like a physical weight, and in his arms, for the first time, I felt like I could finally set it down. A single, hot tear escaped my eye and traced a path down my temple. "You okay?" His voice was a whisper, right beside my ear. It was so quiet I almost thought I had imagined it. But then I felt his thumb gently brush the tear from my skin. He wasn't asleep. He had been awake this whole time. The realization sent a fresh wave of panic and adrenaline through me. My entire body tensed again. I had been caught. My vulnerability, my emotion, laid bare. "Leo," he whispered again, his voice impossibly gentle. I couldn't speak. I could only turn in his arms, a slow, hesitant movement until I was facing him. In the faint, dying glow of the fire, I could just make out the shape of his face, his eyes searching mine in the darkness. His hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. The touch was questioning, tentative, but achingly tender. This was the point of no return. I knew it. My ordered life, my carefully drawn map, it was all gone. And I didn't care. All I cared about was the feel of his hand on my skin, the warmth of his breath, the question in his eyes. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. I met him halfway, closing the last inch of space between us. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, a gentle, questioning pressure against mine. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but one of discovery, of profound, unbelievable tenderness. It was slow and quiet and tasted of coffee and rain. It was the most honest thing I had ever felt. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine. We stayed like that for a long moment, just breathing in the shared space, the air thick with everything that had just happened. My world had been irrevocably altered. The structure had failed, just as he said it would. And in its place, something new and terrifying and beautiful was beginning to be built. The morning after was a study in silence. I woke first, disoriented, to the pale, gray light filtering through the grimy window. For a blissful, confused second, I didn't remember where I was. Then it all came rushing back. The storm, the cabin, Julian. I was still in his arms, my head tucked under his chin, his breathing a soft, steady rhythm against my hair. The intimacy of it, in the harsh light of day, was a shock to my system. I slipped out of his hold as carefully as I could, my movements stiff and awkward. My ankle throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. Julian stirred, but didn't wake. I limped to the window and looked out. The rain had stopped. The world outside was washed clean, dripping, and vividly green. The silence was absolute. And then the doubt began to creep in, a cold, insidious fog. What had I done? What had we done? Last night, in the dark, cocooned by the storm, it had felt real, inevitable. But in the quiet light of morning, it felt like a dream, a dangerous, reckless fantasy. He was married. That gold ring was not a figment of my imagination. Last night was a mistake. A moment of shared vulnerability, of cold and fear and proximity, that had led to something it shouldn't have. He was probably regretting it right now, even in his sleep. When he finally woke, the easy warmth of the previous night had evaporated. The air in the cabin was thick with a new, suffocating awkwardness. He sat up, running a hand over his face, and for a moment, he wouldn't look at me. When he finally did, his expression was guarded, unreadable. "How's the ankle?" he asked. His voice was flat, practical, all business. The tenderness of his whispers in the dark was gone, replaced by a cool, polite distance. "It's sore," I said, my own voice tight. But I think I can walk on it, if I'm careful. Good, he said, already standing, pulling on his boots. The sky is clear. We should get going before more weather rolls in. Every clipped, formal word was a confirmation of my worst fears. He regretted it. He wanted to pretend it never happened. He wanted to get us back to civilization, back to our separate lives, as quickly as possible. The emotional chasm that opened between us in that moment felt wider and more impassable than the entire forest outside. I had been a fool to think that kiss meant anything. I had misread everything. I had ruined the quiet, respectful dynamic we'd had. And for what? A moment of impossible softness in the dark. The hike back was a quiet, miserable ordeal. Julian was relentlessly helpful, fashioning a crude crutch for me from a sturdy branch and insisting on carrying my pack as well as his own. His physical care was constant, his hands steadying me over slippery rocks and muddy patches. But he barely spoke. His kindness felt like a penance, an obligation. He was being decent to the man whose injury had trapped him, the man he had made a terrible mistake with in a moment of weakness. I retreated deep inside myself, rebuilding my walls brick by painful brick. My internal monologue was a frantic, looping spiral of self-recrimination. Stupid, stupid, stupid. You knew he was married. You let yourself believe a fantasy. You pushed him. You took advantage of the situation. Now you've made him uncomfortable. You've made it weird. He probably can't wait to get away from you. Every time his hand brushed mine, every time he put a steadying arm around my waist to help me over an obstacle, I flinched internally. The electric charge was still there, but now it was laced with shame and regret. He was just being kind. I was the one who had turned it into something else. When we finally broke through the trees and saw the parking lot, a wave of both relief and profound sadness washed over me. It was over. Our strange, intimate ordeal was finished. In a few moments, we would get in our separate cars and drive away, and he would go back to his real life, to his wife, and I would go back to my empty apartment. The man from the trail would become a memory tinged with the bitter taste of my own foolishness. He would probably find a new trail to walk on weekends. We reached his truck first. He shrugged off the packs, setting them on the ground. The silence between us was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Well, I started, the words sounding hollow and pathetic. Thank you. For everything. I really don't know how to thank you. I couldn't meet his eyes. I just stared at a patch of gravel near his boots. Leo, he said my name, and the sound of it, so serious and quiet, made me finally look up. He was watching me with that same intense, unreadable expression. My heart plummeted. This was it. The apology. The let's just forget this happened speech. I braced myself. We need to talk, he said. Those 4 words were the ones I had been dreading. You don't have to, I said quickly, wanting to spare us both the humiliation. I get it. Last night it was a weird situation. Cold, dark. It was a mistake. We can just forget it. A strange look passed over his face, something like frustration mixed with pain. It wasn't a mistake, Leo. Not for me. I stared at him, my brain refusing to process his words. But, you're married. I finally choked out the words, gesturing vaguely toward his left hand. Julian looked down at his hand, as if he had forgotten the ring was there. He held it up, turning it in the morning light. He was silent for a long moment before he spoke, his voice low and heavy with a history I couldn't have imagined. This was my father's, he said softly. He passed away 5 years ago. It was his wedding band. My mom gave it to me. He slipped the ring off his finger and held it in his palm. I wear it because, I don't know. It feels like a connection to him. It only fits on this finger, so that's where it stayed. It's just a habit. I was speechless. My entire carefully constructed narrative, the central fact upon which all my assumptions were built, had just been dismantled in a single sentence. He took a deep breath, and the confession continued, a flood of truths that washed away all my anxious fictions. I'm not married. I'm not even dating anyone. The last person I was with, he passed away. 2 years ago, he said it so simply, but the grief was a palpable thing in his voice. It's taken me a long time to even think about meeting someone again. My mind was reeling. My God. I noticed you on the trail months ago, he went on, his eyes finally meeting mine, clear and vulnerable. I kept hoping you'd say something more than just a nod. I thought, well, I wasn't sure. I didn't want to assume. He gave a small, humorless laugh. Turns out we were both making a lot of assumptions. He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. Last night, in the cabin. Leo, I've wanted to do that since the first time I saw you smile, when you thought no one was looking. When I held you, it wasn't because you were cold. I mean, you were cold, but that wasn't the reason. And kissing you was not a mistake. It was the only thing I've been sure about for a very long time. The world tilted on its axis. The relief was so sudden, so absolute. It felt like a physical blow. It was a dam breaking inside me, releasing a flood of emotion that I had kept locked away for years. The ache of my secret admiration, the anxiety of the storm, the tension in the cabin, the shame of the morning, it all dissolved in the face of his staggering, beautiful honesty. I thought you were married, I whispered, the words sounding absurd now. I saw the ring, and I just built a whole story around it. I know, he said, his voice gentle. We need to work on our communication skills. A shaky laugh escaped me. It felt like the first time I had truly breathed all day. My own confession tumbled out, clumsy and heartfelt. I told him how I'd watched him for months, how I'd thought he was impossibly out of reach, a piece of art in a museum. I told him his name was Julian in my head long before I knew it was real, only I'd imagined him as a carpenter. A real, warm smile spread across his face, the one I had only ever seen from a distance. It was even better up close. An architect is close enough, he said. We both build things. And then he closed the small distance that remained between us. He didn't kiss me right away. He just rested his forehead against mine, just as he had in the dark of the cabin. But this time, it wasn't a gesture born of uncertainty. It was a moment of quiet confirmation, of finding a shared center in the bright, clear light of day. So, he murmured, his breath warm against my lips. Just to be clear, you're not just a fan of my dog. I laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt like it came from the deepest part of me. Gus is a very good boy, I said. But no, it was never just about the dog. Good, he whispered. Then he kissed me, and this kiss was nothing like the first. There was no hesitation, no questioning. It was sure and deep and full of all the words we hadn't said for months. It was relief and promise and the overwhelming, profound joy of being found after being lost for so long. It tasted like a new beginning. It felt like coming home. The days that followed felt like learning a new language I had only ever heard spoken from a distance. Our first date was not on the trail. Julian invited me to his house for dinner. It was a small, beautifully restored bungalow on a quiet, tree-lined street, and the moment I stepped inside, I knew I had been right about him. The house smelled of sawdust, fresh coffee, and lemon oil. It was filled with light, clean lines, and evidence of a life lived with care and intention. Architectural models sat on shelves next to stacks of books, and sketches were pinned to a large corkboard in his studio. It was a space that was both perfectly ordered and wonderfully, warmly lived in. It was him. We sat on his comfortable, worn leather sofa and talked for hours. Really talked. We filled in the blank spaces, replacing the stories we had invented about each other with the truth. I told him about my quiet, solitary life, my work, my fear of letting anyone past the carefully constructed walls I lived behind. He told me about his late partner, Michael, speaking of him with a gentle sadness but also a deep, abiding love. He told me about his work, his passion for creating spaces that felt like home, and his own loneliness after Michael was gone. He showed me the plans for the community library he had been struggling with. We spread the large blueprints out on his dining room table, and I saw the conflict he had described, the clash between modern angles and traditional warmth. We talked about it, my designer's eye for balance and his architect's understanding of structure. It was an easy, collaborative rhythm, a conversation that flowed as if we had been having it for years. Later, as he was cooking, I stood leaning against the doorframe of his kitchen, just watching him. He moved with that same familiar, unhurried grace, confident and capable. He glanced over at me and smiled that slow, warm smile that still made my stomach do flips. "What?" he asked, a teasing glint in his eye. "Nothing," I said, smiling back. "I'm just happy." It was the simplest, most honest truth. The constant, low-level anxiety that had been my companion for as long as I could remember had quieted. In its place was a calm, steady warmth that felt a lot like the fire in that old ranger cabin. Our relationship grew in a series of quiet, gentle moments. A shared cup of coffee in the morning before I went to my studio. His hand finding mine as we walked down the street. The comfortable silence as we read side by side on his sofa. Gus snoring softly at our feet. He had a way of grounding me, of making my overthinking mind feel still. His physical presence was a constant reassurance, a solid anchor in the world. He never pushed, never demanded more than I was ready to give, but his steady affection made me want to give everything. He was slowly, patiently, teaching me that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, but a bridge. A few weeks later, we went back to the trail. My ankle was healed, and the day was bright and sunny. It felt strange to be back there, at the scene of my chaotic undoing, but it also felt right. We walked side by side, our hands linked, our steps falling into an easy rhythm. When we reached the spot where I had fallen, Julian stopped. He looked at the gnarled root that had tripped me, then at me, a soft, fond look in his eyes. "I should probably send this root a thank you card," he said, his voice laced with gentle humor. I laughed. "I'm not sure my ankle would agree." "Maybe not," he conceded, pulling me closer and kissing me, right there in the middle of the path. "But I'm grateful. For the storm. For the bad map. For all of it." "Me too," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. That evening, curled up next to him on his sofa, the scent of him a familiar comfort, I thought about the map of my life. I had spent so long drawing it, perfecting the lines, terrified of any deviation from the path. I believed that order was safety, that routine was strength. But the storm had come and washed all the ink away. Getting lost, truly and utterly lost, was the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to me. It had forced me to let go of my control, to depend on someone else, to be vulnerable. And it had led me here, to him. He shifted beside me, draping a warm, heavy arm over my chest and pulling me closer. I rested my head on his shoulder, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. I had been wrong. Connection wasn't about avoiding the chaos. It was about finding the person you wanted to navigate it with. My life no longer felt like a finished map. It felt like an open trail, stretching out ahead of us, winding through sun and shadow. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of not knowing exactly where it would lead. I just knew I wouldn't be walking it alone.